Thank you very much, Thea, and thank you, Gary, for inviting me, and thank you to Maryborough, thank you to Rotary for taking on the question and becoming an activist in an attempt to solve the problem. Fascinating, really. I was driving up here from Melbourne today, and I went out the back. I went up through Ballarat and took the road to Maryborough, and I wandered out the back past Smeaton and all these little near there, not out the back there, but Creswick. And I say out the back because my family actually originated. My Cleary great-grandfather and his brother came from Ireland in the 1860s. And they had a farm across from the Swiss Mountain Hotel at Blampede. And one of the other brothers, Dinny Cleary, was out at Smeaton, had a property there, and so I've sort of researched all these areas. But the point I want to make about that is that as I was driving through the area, you see all the old buildings, the old mechanics institutes, the old pubs and farmhouses, and you think, what was it really like? We have this grand idea of the history of the goldfields and the history of Victoria in the 1850s, and you think, what was really happening in the rural home? What was happening in the little townships of Dalesford and elsewhere in the 1850s and 60s and 70s? What was happening to women? The women buried in the cemeteries who had a tribe of children. What was going on in those homes? Why was it not talked about that violence was a real event in the homes of the Victorian pioneers? Why has it been a secret for so long? These are questions that we have to address. I was thinking, here am I speaking in Maryborough today in 2014, and the first major event I was at in relation to violence against women was in March or April, might have been February, 1989, about a few weeks after the court case involving my sister's murder. My sister was a 25-year-old girl, 9 years younger than me. I'm 61. She was a gorgeous girl, but it didn't matter whether she was or wasn't. She was a woman with her own individuality and her own human rights. She went to work on the 26th of August 1987 and parked her car outside the kindergarten where she worked. She was set upon by her ex-boyfriend, Peter Raymond Keogh, who stabbed her and left her dying in the gutter outside the kindergarten. He went off and had a coffee just around the corner, eventually gave himself up to police several hours later. He went to court in February 1989, was granted a defence of provocation, found not guilty of murder, and sentenced to 3 years and 11 months in jail. Now you might think, well, that event would change my life or influence everything I say about violence against women. Well, it has a major role in what I say about violence against women. But it's a bigger issue than that, in that it was a catalyst for me to look into other cases of violence against women and to hear the stories over the years from so many women about violence inflicted upon them. When I began to read the transcripts of other cases like my sister's, I couldn't believe it. I'd gone to university. I'd marched against the Vietnam War. I was anti-conscription. I was considered left-wing. I believed in human rights. I saw a courtroom treat a killer like a victim. I saw a courtroom treat a woman like she had no human rights, that she had no right to leave a man. And there were the other cases I read. R.V. Crowe, a woman shot dead in front of her 2 children by an estranged husband. Not guilty to murder, Your Honour. Less than 4 years in jail. Zeren Dinsa, stabbed by her stepfather in South Melbourne, a girl I had taught in 1981. She was stabbed and her stepfather was found not guilty of murder. Then we roll on through all the cases and we get to R.V. Ramage in 2003, not guilty of murder after strangling his estranged wife in their North Baldwin home, a well-to-do businessman. Then we have recent cases. The provocation law's gone. Probably a lot to do with my campaigning over the years, they say. and I'll accept that it had a lot to do with my campaigning, and I'm proud of the fact that my campaigning about provocation brought to light the injustices of our criminal justice system. But not only that, that we have a culture that treats women like they belong to men, and we've treated it that way in the courtrooms. What we've done in courtrooms is say to women, you have no right to leave a man, and if you do leave the man and he kills you, you are culpable. Hence the manslaughter verdicts that continue to be handed down in our courtrooms under the old defensive homicide law. A stream of cases in Victoria. So when we look to India and we talk about honour killings in India, pause for a minute and ponder the 60 women a year murdered in Australia by the man in her life, and all of the other cases of violence against women. And that we can touch on the emotional violence. The emotional violence is the backdrop to the cultural settings that allow the violence to continue against women. So what's critical about this program is a number of things. One, it says we have to have a proper discussion about violence against women. We need the community to engage in conversation. But more importantly, the program, the initiative says that women are not responsible for the violence. What the program is saying in its own subtle way, irrespective of whatever strategies are employed, is that women are not at fault, that it is men who are responsible for the violence. And then we have to ponder how we deal with this. My campaign is about culture. We could talk about the courts. I've had views about how the courts ought to operate. 25 years ago, when my sister's killer was sentenced, Justice George Hampel spoke for 3.5 minutes and delivered a sentencing document that ran for 2.5 foolscap pages. You imagine being my mother, who passed away a couple of years ago, and sitting there and watching a courtroom find the killer not guilty to murder, then spend less than 5 minutes discussing the nature of the murder and its impact on a family and a community. Today, a judge will speak for no less than 40 minutes. But you know why? Because the judges know that we will go after them if they do not show respect for a dead woman, if they don't address what the judge said in R.V. Ramage is the scourge of family violence. So, family violence is a scourge. It is everywhere. Why is it everywhere? Because in the modern construct, post-feminism, women have asserted their right to independence. Our women, our daughters, our sisters, not someone else's anonymous person. They're our women. All of them are our women, our friends, our sisters, our daughters. And we do not want to live in a society that says to a woman, we'll give you your human rights, your right to separate, your right to divorce, your right to say no to a man, but when he kills you, we'll blame you in a courtroom. Or we'll run newspaper articles that blame you. We'll run an article in a newspaper like The Age recently that at the bottom says, next week's article, why men hurt the women they love or hurt the people they love? I will swear that is bullshit. We should never tolerate that kind of language in any newspaper. Violent men don't hurt the women they love. They hurt the women they hate because a woman has asserted her independence. Yes, I'm political on the question, so Gary knows this. Once you take up the cudgels, Gary, she's a tough gig. She's a tough gig. There are no compromises. You have to accept that violent men must be dealt with. Now, the police protocols have changed, Paul, haven't they? We're in a much stronger position than we've ever been. The police protocols are simple. Police have a responsibility to deal with violent men. The premise is that we get violent men out of the home. But in the cases where women want to leave, we have to protect those women. So we need the right settings. We need to argue for government funding to protect women from violent men. But essentially, to the men in the room, what is the challenge? Very simply, the men in the room have to accept that it is our responsibility to remind our mates that we never accept the violence, that the violence will be condemned, and that we will stand between them morally and physically and the women they hurt. You can't stand at the bar with a bloke who says he hits the missus. You can't kick the football down at Bendigo Gold or anywhere else with a bloke who belts his missus and not take umbrage at his behaviour. So she's a political question. What do we do? Well, we have the conversation as we are having it today. We have the conversation, and at the end of it we have enough courage to say that family violence is extensive, that it's a product of men, an underbelly of men who refuse to accept the human rights of women. And then we move to the actions that are necessary to deal with that. They're all the cultural questions, Gary, the tweeting, the emails, the internet, using that, picking up the media, picking up the courts, picking up popular culture, when the popular culture treats women like commodities, as in the AFL clubs have done from time to time, and I have been quick to criticise them in a world in which I live and have to exist and have to bump into people who I know might be part of the problem. But I'm not scared to take these issues up. It may be, yes, I lost a sister. I had a sister murdered, so I'm hardline about it. But again, my argument is for all the women, the human rights of all the women. So, let's change the culture. This is a great start. I was in WA at the Rotary meeting, I think, Gary, I'm not sure it was this year, or I think it was last year, or the end of last year, and I'm thinking, what's happening? All these groups are now talking. People might say, from the Haughty Brigade, might say, oh gee, why would Maryborough Rotary be taking up the question? What a great message that is for all of us, that groups everywhere are now wanting to talk, that men are gathering with their sisters, their wives and their friends to say, we want to find strategies to deal with family violence. And finally, we have come a long, long way since my sister's murder in 1987. A long way since that day when I sat in the Melbourne Town Hall with my mother and watched a female police officer crying, and I listened to the discussion about violence against women, which at that point was silent. Today people are talking. Today people are posing strategies. Today judges are very sensitive about what they say. Today the police force has changed. Today governments are now conscious of their responsibility. The Labor government, the Labor opposition in Victoria has said it will have a Royal Commission into family violence if elected. So it should. I argued for that 3 weeks earlier. They didn't acknowledge the fact that I had put the argument forward, and I was annoyed because I was putting the argument forward for all women. And I thought, as the brother of a murdered woman, they might have just acknowledged my work on the score. So, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm proud of the fact, Gary, that you've got this going. I'm proud of the fact that communities everywhere are now engaged. We need to stop the violence. Last point. I watched my mother in the courtroom and in the years that followed deal with the murder of her daughter, of a beautiful girl who loved her mother and shared time with her mother. I read my mother's diaries after she died. Every single month of every year, on the day of Vicky's birthday and the day of her murder, Mum wrote a little note to her daughter. And at some time she wrote a letter to her daughter who had been murdered years earlier, talking of the love she had for her daughter. I came to understand then acutely just what a devastating impact violence has on mothers. Not to say fathers and brothers and sisters, but acutely to mothers who bear a child and to see a child hurt. is a terrible thing. And so I tasted all of that, and I swore to my mum that the struggle would go on so that other mothers didn't have to experience that. And we want to tell our girls, finally, Gary, we want to tell our girls, our sisters, our friends, it's never their fault that a man is violent. It is never, ever their fault. And let them have the confidence to come to us, to know that they don't have to experience shame. Have the confidence to come to us and say, the man in my life is dangerous, is violent, is hurting me, so that we can act. And I hope that Rotary taking a stand like it has today instigates that kind of reaction from the women of Maryborough and elsewhere. Thank you very much.